All right, can everyone hear me okay now?
Yes.
Good. My name's Gene Hopkins, and I'm from Indiana. And I've been asked to come today and talk about the history of the sport of bow hunting. Now, to me, it's more than just a history of the sport of bow hunting. It's about keeping the spirit alive, and that's what I really want to focus on, is having this stuff and looking at this stuff and holding this stuff is cool. But to feel this stuff, to really feel the spirit when you pick up a bow that was shot by Fred Bearer or something that was made by Art Young. That's what it's really all about. Can you feel the spirit? So that's why I call this talk, Keeping the Spirit Alive. So why do we care? Why does this mean so much to people like us? Well, I'm one of those guys that when I walk through the cornfield and I look down and I pick up a stone arrowhead, I don't just pick up a stone arrowhead. I pick up that arrowhead and I look at it and I think about who made this? When did they make this? Why did they lose this ear? What's the story behind this stone arrowhead? And that's the same kind of spirit that I'm talking about, right? It's not just a stone point. This is somebody's life. This was a point, this was something that happened in that person's life 10,000 years ago. Why did he lose it here? What's the story? And when I look at this stuff, and especially when I pick up some of the stuff that was from the people that I looked up to and admired as I was growing up, I think about the campfires. I think about, this is my way. I was lucky enough to get to spend time with Fred Bear. I had a business where I was a Fred Bear dealer. So I got to know Fred, he wouldn't walk down the street and say, hey, Gene, but, I got to know Fred Bear. I got to drink beer with Fred Bear on Bourbon Street, right? But to be able to do those kinds of things, you can still do that. You can pick up a book written by Art Young or Saxon Pope. You can read the magazine stories, and you can still, it's the closest thing we can be to sitting around a campfire and having a conversation with those people. That's, my mind works that way. That's exactly the way I feel when I pick up that magazine or that book and I look through it. Or I see that autograph, and I pick up that wood bow, and I think about this wood bow was made by this person, Bill Holberth, Saxon Pope, Art Young, with a spoke shave and a draw knife. And they stood over this piece of wood, and they worked with their own hands this bow down. Their sweat is on this piece of wood. Okay? That's what excites me about this. So it all begins, the story of us, as I call it. I love this picture. This is Gene Wenzel. And I set my collection up at the Indiana Bow Hunters Association banquet a few years ago where we had Gene come in and was the guest speaker. And Gene sat there literally for hours. I'm not kidding. He sat there all day long. Every case, he would go from case to case and he would study how that arrow was made. Because every arrow is a different person. Every arrow is a different person's craftsmanship. He would study every arrow and how they made those points, how they made those nocks, how they made those feathers, how they crested the arrows. This is the kind of passion that we feel. It's not just stuff to us. It's not worth anything to me, right? Monetarily, it's not worth anything to me. It's the spirit that's what's worth something. The quote that we all know, so long as the new moon returns in heaven, a bent, beautiful bow, so long will the fascination of archery keep hold of the hearts of men. That's who we are. That's why we're here. We all feel the spirit. So I'm going to take you through the evolution. This is kind of our genealogy. And I know I've talked to several people this weekend and they say, you know what, I've shot for a long time, but I really don't know the roots of our sport. I really don't know how we got to where we are and who we are and how we got here. So it really begins, in my book, it begins with the story of the Thompson brothers. Will and Morris Thompson, spelled Maurice Thompson, pronounced Morris Thompson. The Thompson brothers, Morris was actually born in Indiana in 1844. His brother Will was born in Missouri a couple of years later. They moved to the South. Their father was a Baptist preacher. They moved to the state of Georgia just before the Civil War. The Civil War broke out. They fought on the side of the South. After the war was over, they came back. By all accounts, which I believe, now it can't be documented to be perfectly accurate, But I believe that Morris was wounded in the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864. I believe he suffered some kind of a chest wound in 1864. So he came back, and he and his brother they were writers. They were writing some magazine articles about shooting with a bow and arrow, but they went to the Everglades of Florida, and they spent 2 years in the Everglades doing nothing but hunting with a bow and arrow. And they were taking their canoes back into the swamps, and they were shooting things today we wouldn't even think about, egrets and things like this, right? But they spent 2 years in the Everglades hunting with a bow and arrow and writing articles to send back to the magazines of the day, Harper's Weekly, Scribner's. Those magazines were the place where our sport really began. From those guys writing those stories, sending back, and now people are reading for the first time and starting to get excited about hunting with a bow and arrow. It was a lost art. Even the Indians had lost the bow and arrow when the white man came and the rifle came. So these articles were so popular that Scribner's decided they would publish them into a book. So they republished those magazine articles into a book in 1878 called The Witchery of Archery. If you get a chance to read The Witchery of Archery, it's been reprinted many times. You don't have to go buy an original copy and spend a few $100s. You can buy the paperback reprints for $10, $20, right? This is where we all began. So that book in 1878 was so popular, there were only 300 of those 1878 copies printed. They sold out like that. So they came out almost immediately with an 1879 edition. The 1878 on the far left, and you can see them over in my collection there. The green copy, 1878, the brown copy, 1879, and the tan copy, 1928. Read this book. If you really want to feel the spirit, read this book. Okay, now, think about 1878, 1879. You couldn't go down to the store and buy commercially made equipment. There were some longbows that were being brought over from England, D-section, horn, noctile, target bows. But if you wanted to hunt with a bow and arrow, you just finished reading The Witchery of Archery, and I think I want to try this hunting with a bow and arrow thing. You couldn't go down to the store, you couldn't even go to the magazine or the catalogs and buy archery equipment. You had to make your own archery equipment. So in 1879, Peck and Snyder, who was kind of the Sears and Roebuck of the day, they had a catalog that you could buy everything from toilets to badminton to anything. They decided they were going to start commercially producing and selling archery equipment for the first time, 1879, Peck and Snyder. So you can see there in the middle, the Peck and Snyder broadhead, on the far right there, the Peck and Snyder broadhead. That was the first commercially made archery equipment for us in America to hunt with, 1879. The sport kind of, it grew, it had an explosion, but it kind of leveled off, plateaued off. There were a few dozen people across the country that stayed hunting with the bow and arrow. Until this is a major event in our genealogy, our history, August 29th, 1911. And I think that's fascinating because my grandparents were alive in 1911. This is recent history. August 29th, 1911, this wild Indian comes down on the mountains in California. He had never been in contact with white men before. If you get to read the story of Ishi, this is the story of Ishi. Never been in contact with white men before. He knew that there were these people down in the valleys, the white men, but he knew if you went down, you didn't come back. His people had been wiped out by the prospectors. He was literally the last of his tribe. He spent like 2 years up in the mountains all by himself. He got so lonely, he says, I'm going down. I know there's people down there. I know they kill people like me, but I'm going down there. I'm so lonely. I'd rather die than be lonely like this the rest of my life. So he goes down into the stockyard, and he gets literally surrounded by the dogs of the stockyard. The stock people come out, and they surround him, they capture him, and they take him off to the University of California, Berkeley, to study this last wild Indian. Who was the doctor that was assigned to him at the University of California, Berkeley? Saxton Pope, Dr. Saxton Pope. So now we see our family tree is starting to grow. We were the Thompson brothers and a few people in the late 1800s that were hunting with a bow and arrow. Now Ishi comes down, Saxton Pope befriends Ishi as his doctor. Saxton had an interest in archery, but he didn't know how to hunt with a bow and arrow. So Ishi took him under his wing and taught him how to hunt with the bow and arrow, how to decoy, how to call, how to get close to your game. There were stories written in newspapers all across the country about this last wild man. And you know what? Ishi was not his name. Because in his culture, it was not allowed to speak your own name. He could never tell anybody what his name was. So they gave him the name Ishi because that was the name for the term for man in the Yahi language. So today, we still don't know what Ishi's real name was. So Pope befriends Ishi. Newspaper articles are written all across the country about this last wild man, and people were going and visiting University of California, Berkeley to get to see this wild Indian in person. Well, who were some of those people that went to see Ishi? So Pope was assigned to take care of the medical care of Ishi. One of the people that came to see Ishi was Art Young. Art Young was in Detroit at the time. Art Young read the newspaper articles and said, I'm going to get on the train and I'm going to go out and I'm going to see this wild Indian, and because I love archery, I'm going to go out and see. He didn't know Saxton Pope at that time. He goes out to visit, meet Ishi. Another person who did the same thing about the same time was Chief Compton. So this magic happened that Pope, Young, Compton all end up there at the same place at the same time because of Ishi. I love it the way they dressed, riding the horses with the tie, white shirt and tie.
Was Chief Compton Native American?
Chief Compton was not Native American. He was actually born in Minnesota, moved to Nebraska. He was born in 1868, moved to Nebraska, lived with the Sioux. Okay, but he was not Sioux. And that's why they named him Chief, but he was not Native.
And he learned his archery from the Sioux, or?
He learned the bow and arrow from the Sioux, but even the Sioux had kind of lost their ability to hunt with the bow and arrow, right?
Compton shot longbow. I mean, I think it's that one.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. Okay, so now we've got Ishi, Pope, Young, Compton, all going out into the hills in California, and Ishi's taking them back to his native ancestral grounds, and he's teaching them how to hunt, how to get close, how to call, how to decoy animals, and hunt with a bow and arrow. That was August 29, 1911 when that story started, but Ishi had never been in contact with white man, so he immediately came down with every sniffle, every virus that we are all immune to. He got it. And he got tuberculosis relatively fast after he came into captivity. And he died in 1916, so there were only a very short 5 years to be able to spend time with Ishi. But it's pretty cool. If you Google Ishi, you can actually go out, and they made voice recordings of Ishi. You can go out and listen to Ishi singing songs, his ancestral songs, the real voices of Ishi. Look how emaciated Ishi looks in that picture. This is just before his death. Okay, so after Ishi died, Pope, Young, Compton continued what they had learned from Ishi. They spent a lot of time in the mountains of California, and then they started branching out, going to other areas, hunting with bow and arrow. 1923, Pope felt very strongly that he wanted to write down what he had learned from Ishi. So in 1923, he wrote this book on the left there, Hunting with the Bow and Arrow. Almost that entire book is what he learned from Ishi, put down into words. How to make an arrow, how to make a bow, how to make a string, how to get close, how to call, how to decoy. This is the Ishi story. Okay, that book, 1923, was extremely popular. So now from a few hundred, maybe from a few dozen to a few hundred, now we're starting to see thousands of people starting to hunt with a bow and arrow. hunt for the fun of it, not for survival. If I wanted to hunt for survival, I'd take my rifle. I'm going out with a bow and arrow to hunt because this is a wonderful time, a challenge. This book has been reprinted many times. You can see on the far right there, the 1974 edition that was printed by the Fredbear Sports Club. It's actually in the auction tonight. Still in wraps. Okay, interesting story. We all know the Easton Archery Company. Doug Easton, as a young man, was out rabbit hunting in California. Came back from the rabbit hunt, leaned his shotgun against the truck fender, and the shotgun fell and discharged and almost blew his leg off. He's in the hospital for over a year. During his time in the hospital, somebody brings him a copy of Hunting with the Bow and Arrow by Sexton Pope. During his time in the hospital, he's reading this story of hunting with the bow and arrow, and it piques his interest, and he says, I'm going to do that. When I get out of here, that's what I'm going to do. So that's how Doug Easton, the Easton Archery Company, got in. Our family tree, our genealogy, is very small at this point, but it's starting to grow. Now we're seeing people like Doug Easton get involved in the sport. Now we start to see publicity. We start to see things like Art Young went to Alaska in 1918. And when he went to Alaska, he made a black and white movie of his adventures in Alaska. He killed a moose, he killed a grizzly bear, and he brings his silent movies back, and he goes across the country, touring the country, going into the local movie theaters and showing his Alaskan adventure as a black and white movie, silent movie. It was a big deal. It was like going to the circus, and they would have big exhibits set up with big signage you can see here. Come see Art Young hunt with a bow and arrow in Alaska. One of the people who went to see that Art Young Alaskan Adventures movie was a young man by the name of Fred Bear. Fred Bear was living in Detroit. He goes to the movie theater, 1926, 1927, and sees the Alaskan Adventures by Art Young. And Art, when the movie was showing, Art would be up talking, because it was a silent movie. Art would be up narrating the movie. Okay, so after the movie, Fred goes up and introduces himself to Art, and they strike a friendship up. That's how Fred Bear got into hunting with bow and arrow, because he was a rifle hunter up till that time. Fred Bear started, he was working in the automotive industry. The automotive industry fell on really hard times in the Depression, and Fred Bear decided he wanted to make some archery equipment. He was making leather goods. He was making arm guards, gloves, quivers, things like that, just leather goods. So he started this company called Bear Products around 1933. That was Fred Bear's beginning as a manufacturer of archery equipment. You look at the early Bear Products catalogs, there's no arrows, there's no bows, things like that, it's just leather goods. Okay, now, when you look at some of the early equipment, you're going around garage sales and you see something that looks old, look for that. That's a clue. Look for things that say Bear Products there on the left. Bear Products. That tells you that was the first Fred Bear made equipment. So he made Bear Products from about 1933 until about 1940, when he sold off the non-archery part of the business and started focusing on only the archery part of the business and called it Bear Archery Company. He employed a bow maker by the name of Nels Grumley. Nels Grumley started making bows under the Bear Products label, and then continued making bows up through Bear Archery until about 1947, 48, when Bear decided he was going to move from Detroit up to Grayling, which at that time was in the middle of nowhere in Michigan. Fred Bear won the 1934 Michigan State Championship, and that trophy on the left there is the actual trophy that Fred won in 1934 at that first, well, his first Michigan State Championship, 1934. That trophy's over here, by the way, if you want to see it. And inside that trophy, when I got this trophy, there was a little notebook. And I pulled out the little notebook, and this is one of the pages inside that little notebook. Fred Bear wrote the day he won that championship. He wrote the date, his score, signed it, Fred B. Bear. And you'll notice the signature is similar, but it's not the typical what we see today as the Fred Bear signature. And then Fred understood that he had a career, he had a future in this archery business that he wanted to promote. And he was very good. That's what separated Fred from everybody else. He was a marketing genius. So he was able to take this hobby and turn it into a business. And he realizes that he can have an impact and he can help the sport grow. So he starts writing articles in magazines and he starts making some movies. And some of those movies, we've all seen those movies, but the earliest movies, some of those we're still looking for. At that same time, there were also other people out there promoting the sport. Howard Hill was a very good promoter as well. Howard was spending his time at that time over in California. And if you watch the first Robin Hood movies, many people don't understand those were not trick shots. In the early Robin Hood movie with Errol Flynn, Howard Hill is doing the shooting. And that's him actually shooting, splitting arrows. That's actually him shooting people off horseback. They would put blocks of wood under their costume and he would shoot them off horseback. And the people that were the actors that he was shooting off the horses said that they didn't have to act. He was shooting such a heavyweight bow, when the arrow hit their block of wood under their costume, it knocked them off the horse. Okay, but it was Fred's marketing genius that really got our sport off the ground back in the 40s. So he was really understanding the power of movies. He was understanding the power of being able to document what he was doing and share that with the world. Now, I don't know how many of you, a lot of you, over the last couple of days have come up to me out here and said, how do you find all this stuff? You old guys, you found it all. It's already all gobbled up and there's nothing left for me to find. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. This box, this wooden box you see right here next to the rocking chair, is a box that walked into me at a show. I was set up at a show just like this a few years ago in Indianapolis. And the Thompson brothers, remember, were from Indiana, Crawfordsville, Indiana. This box walked up to me, a guy walked up and said, I got something you might want. I got on a wooden box arrows, and I thought, okay, wooden box arrows, cool, 1930s, all right, I'd like to see it. No, it wasn't a wooden box of a dozen arrows, it was this piece of furniture. And when you open the lid of this piece of furniture, inside are 109 arrows. Some of them have broadheads, and some of them are target arrows. Now, I had found a Will Thompson bow at the Cloverdale archery tournament several years ago, a real Will Thompson bow with a signed Will Thompson arrow that came with the bow. So I had in my possession Will Thompson's equipment, bow and an arrow, signed by Will. So this box walks in, and I open it up. Inside are 109 arrows, and I can see that this is 1800s vintage stuff. Square nails in the box. The arrows are obviously manufactured pre-1900s. And I pull out one of the target arrows, and on the target arrow is writing in the same penmanship and in the same pen as the Will Thompson arrow that I had gotten several years before that. So I had it sent off to what I consider an expert up in Chicago, and he came back and he said, that's the same writing with the same pen. Whoever that first arrow belonged to, those other arrows belong to that same person. So I cannot guarantee it, but with pretty good certainty, just recently from an estate sale in Crawfordsville, Indiana, this guy had bought this box of Thompson Brothers arrows. And he brings them to me at a show in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I get the whole box. So stuff is still out there. I mean, this is like finding the Holy Grail, right? These are the broadheads that were in that box. Now, notice the similarity on the top right to those Peck and Schneider broadheads earlier. There were also Horsman. Horsman was another company that was making equipment for the Thompson brothers. But what really sealed the deal for me was that lower right, that pewter blunt. And I was familiar with an article that Morris Thompson had written, and I had to go back and find it again, but I found it. Morris Thompson wrote an article on how to make small game blunts using newspaper and pewter. And he would take the arrow shaft and he would wet the newspaper, form the newspaper around the bottom of the shaft, and pour the molten pewter into the wet newspaper. And that's how he made his blunts. These blunts, there's about 18 of these blunts in that box, and you can still see, on some of them, you can still see the newspaper where he poured the molten pewter into there. So stuff is still out, good stuff is still out there. This is, you can see that the arrow on the top is one that came from this box. The arrow on the bottom is the one that I have that's actually signed by Will. Okay. So if you know what you're looking for, it really helps, but there's really good stuff out there. Now, Ishi. The box on the right, on the left there, are authentic, genuine Ishi-made points. So people would come to Ishi, and they would bring him glass. They would bring him broken plates. They would bring him broken milk glass from milk jugs. And he would sit there and he would nap points for them during their visits. Okay, so that point on the left there is now in my possession as of about 18 months ago. So stuff is still out there. And it's documented. I'm the 5th person to ever own that issue point, back to the person, including the person that he made it for.
What are the dimensions of that? Approximately.
Approximately, the one on the left is 3.5.
Half an inch wide.
Yeah. And it's so meticulously made. You know, I've spent a lot of time with nappers in my life and watched them make it. It's amazing what they can do. But even a napper today, a really good napper, will look at issue points and go, oh my God, how do you do that? You know, look at the notches and look how narrow and how precise everything is.
So
and the thickness is uniform all the
In
way
that
top to
area in
bottom.
California, have they found other heads similar to that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, Glenn St. Charles was another one of my heroes. And I used to get up on Saturday morning and I'd turn on the TV and I couldn't wait for American Sportsman to come on and see if Fred Bear, Glenn St. Charles, or Rich Gresham were going to be on the American Sportsman that morning. And so I got to really have this hero worship for this man named Glenn St. Charles. And then over the years, I got to actually know Glenn St. Charles as a friend. He would come to my house, I would go to his house. We went flea marketing together and things like that. And I know a lot of you have had that experience with Glenn, such a great, humble man. But that on the left there is the jig that Glenn made his Mickey Finn broadheads with. And when Glenn quit, he left that last Mickey Finn in that jig. So that's the last Mickey Finn broadhead that Glenn was ever going to make. He left it in the jig. And that's again, you know, the story behind the stuff. It's not the stuff, it's the story behind the stuff. So what do you look for? I love books. Books is one of my weaknesses because, again, when I read a book, I'm talking to that person. They're talking to me. It's their words. I can hear their voice. I can smell the campfire when I'm reading a book. I went down and hunted pigs in Osceola, Turkey, on Fishing Creek in the Everglades, Florida, because that's where the Witchery of Archery was written. And I took a copy of the Witchery with me and laid in a tent at night by candlelight reading The Witchery of Archery on the side of Fish Eating Creek. That's the kind of spirit, right, that I feel with this stuff. So when I'm reading a book or a magazine article, I'm not just reading the words, I'm having a conversation with the person who wrote that. So some of the books that I really enjoy, that Adventurous Bowman up in the top left there, when Pope and Young went to Africa in 1926, they came back and they wrote this book, The Adventurous Bowman. 2 months after that book was published, Pope died. So there's a signed copy of Adventurous Bowman out here if you want to see it. But there were only 2 months there, so that I know of only 2 copies that are in collectors' hands that are signed by Pope. There was such a short period of time before he died. But also on that trip was another gentleman by the name of Stuart Edward White. Stuart Edward White was a rifle hunter. He went on the same hunts, the same day, the same trees, at the same time, and came back and wrote the same stories from a rifleman's perspective and called it Lions in the Path. Another great book. So the fun of that is to read one and then immediately turn down and put it down, and pick the other one up and read the other one. Just the different points of view. Did you get that? Is that now your book? There's a Lions in the Path for sale here this weekend. So.
I can take you home. Now, the other thing, I can get you there. For everybody else, Governor, State of Indiana, still locked down. You guys can't come in. Done. Don't let anybody stand by Indiana.
And then Hunting the Hard Way by Howard Hill, another great book. Howard had some great adventures. There's an unknown book by Howard Hill, or not by, but of Howard Hill, that I think you all should know about and maybe look to see if you can get it, called The Early Adventures of Howard Hill. So Howard Hill started really down in Florida, and his career started off, archery golf was going to be the next big thing. So he had a career, he had a job going around the country building archery golf courses, just like Jack Nicklaus and people like that go around today building golf courses. He was going around the country building archery golf courses. So this is the 1920s. And there's a book, he took a young man with him who was a teenager at the time named Don Carson. And Don Carson helped Howard Hill grow his business through the 1920s until Howard Hill became Howard Hill. So Don Carson wrote down the story in handwritten form. And then eventually, just a few years ago, somebody got those handwritten notes and turned that book out now into a hardback book called The Early Adventures of Howard Hill. Okay, not many people know of that book, but get that book and you can still get it relatively cheap. As a matter of fact, I can help you get a copy for less than 20 bucks. Anytime I get a book, if I go to an old bookstore, I go to a flea market, I come across an archery book, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up. I'm going to look to see if it's signed, is it autographed. Be surprised how many Fredbear field notes are sold on eBay and the seller doesn't say anything about it being signed. And you get it, you buy it, you get it, open it up, and it's signed by Fred. How many times I've gotten books like the Pope book, Hunting with Bow and Arrow, and open it up. There's one out here. I opened it up when I got it. There were black and white original photographs from their Africa trip with Pope's writing on the back. That were never mentioned in the sales clip. Okay, so look through the books. You'll be amazed at what you can find inside the books. These were Howard Hill prototype. Everybody knows the 3-to-1 ratio of Howard Hill broadheads, but Howard Hill experimented with a lot of different styles of broadheads before he settled on that. These were some of the early prototype Howard Hill broadheads, and they're out here in the box if you'd like to see them. So what do you look for? Fredbear, everybody knows again of the Razorhead, but Fredbear didn't come out with the Razorhead until 1956. From 1930s, 40s until 1956, he was selling other people's broadheads. So the one in the red, the one that's painted red there on the left, Fred special ordered from Roy Case. Roy Case was making the Kiska broadhead. Kiska was a barbed broadhead. Fred said, make me a Kiska broadhead to cut the barbs off. So those are Bear special order and you can kind of pick up on them pretty quickly. If you see something that's red painted like this, and it looks like it could have been a Kiska with no barbs, those are very hard to find. Those are the early special order case Kiska broadheads. And then Fred started experimenting with wider cuts, and he would take the early Zwickis and he would slot the Zwickis and he would put these, we call these airplane bleeders in there. And so these are 3 different styles of airplane bleeders that Fred was experimenting with before he came out with the Razorhead. The Razorheads. There are broadheads on that page right there that are worth $3 to $5. There are broadheads on that page that are worth $2,000 each. Can you tell the difference? Okay, the difference is when Fred was starting experimenting with coming out with his new broadhead, which he eventually called the Razorhead, on the far left there, maybe you can't really see it, but see how wide those vents are. Okay, those vents are very wide compared to the one on the far right here. See how those vents have been tapered down. Also notice at the end of the ferrule, there's this little dimple. Okay, we call it the pinned bear, but it's really just a press dimple there. Those pinned bears right there, there's 2 in my collection. I could get pretty quickly $2,000 a piece for them if I want.
Is that just an improvement in design? Just make it stronger, I guess, the broadside.
Yeah, so the progression, the evolution of the head. So when he made the pinned head, the pinned bear, those were experimental. Those were prototypes. He made 300 of them. And he sent them out to all his buddies, and he said, try these out, take them out and kill stuff, and then come back and tell me how they worked. I need you to field test them for me. So they did. So that's why not many of them exist anymore, is because they did exactly what he told them to do, go out and shoot them. They lost them in the swamps and in the woods. Then he came out with the middle one there on the left. That's the first production model. We call it the bubble, I call it the bubble head. But notice at the end of the ferrule, how the end of the ferrule is rounded, okay? And reports came back pretty quickly to Fred after he started selling them that was impeding penetration. That little bubble at the end of the ferrule there was slowing down penetration. So you can see that in 1957 he started taking that ferrule and he started flattening it out. And then he started changing how big the vents were. And what he was working toward was getting a broadhead that would penetrate and hold together well. Okay. So the one on the far right is the one everybody knows. That's the 1964 model. That's the common.
What was the last year was production?
Sorry?
What was the last year of these 1964 brothers?
In 78 they came out with the stainless.
78.
78 they came out with the stainless
That was
silver
it.
razor
That
heads.
was the last year.
Okay, more Fredbear, interesting. Top left there, the one with the nails on it, spikes. Fred wanted to come out with a bowfishing head. He wanted to go kill some large fish with his bow. So he handmade a dozen of these razor heads with these spikes on there for shark fishing. We call them the shark head today. And when Fred passed away, those were found in his desk drawer. And now there were only 12 made by Fred. So there are a few of them floating around out there. All right, so if you've got an interest in collecting, how do you get started? How do I go from, I think I like this, to getting involved? It's really very easy. There are a lot of people in this room right now, John Cabisa, Russell Lentier, Herb Higgins, there's a lot of people in this room right now, Mike Dahmers, who are collectors. Just talk to them. Build your network. That's the first thing I tell people. Build a network of people who have a like interest, and you'll be amazed at how quickly your network's going to grow. Okay, there's also some organizations like the American Broadhead Collectors Club, formed in 1974. Join the American Broadhead Collectors Club, ABCC. 300 like-minded people who, even though they call it the Broadhead Collectors Club, we collect everything. Catalogs, books, broadheads. That's a great club to join. When I joined the ABCC, I would literally come home every night and there would be a box in my mailbox of older members who were sending me stuff, welcome to the club. doesn't happen as much anymore because there's so much monetary value on this stuff today, people don't give it away like they used to. They have annual meetings, they have a nice newsletter, they have several publications, and this is the place where if you want to find somebody that really knows what they're doing, they're probably in this club. Okay, there's also some places on the internet to go. I wrote some articles several years ago, on stickbow. They're still out there. So if you Google archery collecting, the first answer that will come back in Google is these stickbow articles that I wrote probably, I don't know, back in the early 90s, 20 years ago. But they're still out there, and I think they're still pretty good. There's also a website out there called vintagearchery.org. There's some really good information out there as well. Go into Facebook. An amazing number of groups out there on Facebook now that are all focused around collecting archery equipment. So I have one called Archery Collecting, that's mine. And I have one called Archery Collecting Buy, Sell, and Trade, that's mine. But there are others out there for bear archery collectors, traditional bear archery group, vintage broadhead collectors. Just go out to Facebook and put into search vintage archery or vintage broadheads, and they'll come back and make suggestions for you for these groups that you can join. And not only will you meet a lot of people that enjoy this collecting, keeping the spirit alive, but you'll also see that they do a lot of trading out there on those sites. If you have some stuff, you can put it out there and say, what's this? Tell me what this is. Is it worth anything? And you'll have some people that really know what they're talking about come back and help you. I think one of the most underappreciated resources there is are the old magazines. And you can still buy these old magazines for $3 a piece, $2 a piece. Fantastic articles written by the early pioneers of our sport and advertisements for just about everybody that was making anything. Go back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and look through these magazines. You'll be amazed at what you can learn from a $3 magazine that you bought down at the archery shoot at the slot meet. The old catalogs. Bear catalogs have gotten pretty valuable. A set of bear catalogs, the first bear catalog number 20, they didn't date them back then. They called it catalog number 20, catalog number 23, catalog number 24, all the way up to the late 70s, early 80s. A set can cost you maybe $2,000. That's a lot of money. But there are reproductions you can get. You can get ones on DVD. And if they're not bear, you can buy the other company catalogs pretty cheap. There was a set of Fleetwood catalogs just sold this week for $25, and it was like 10 years of early Fleetwood catalogs. In those catalogs is a wealth of information about equipment. So you can start to study, you can start to understand, you can start to teach yourself what to look for. And there's a lot of really good publications out there. Wade Phillips did that book in the middle there called Broadheads, 1871 and 1971. There's been 3 editions of it. They're all sold out. But I think maybe he's coming out with the 4th edition of it. But you can still pick them up used now and then. That book it's about this thick. And it has life-size, actual-sized pictures of all the broadheads that were made in 1871 and 1971. It will tell you how wide they were, how long they were, how much did they weigh. It'll give you a little description about who made them, where they made them, when did they make them, and you can lay your broadhead right on that picture, and it's actual size. Is this really my broadhead? Okay, if you can get a hold of that book, it's a great source. There was also the broadheads 1972 to 2002, which has got a lot more, but it's not replaceable blade broadheads, it's just the fixed blade stuff. And then there are other books. Fish points are really starting to take off. Fish points, the collectors of fish points are starting to really get very interested in growing. So fish points may be a good place for you to start, because you may have a box full of fish points that nobody's gone through yet. Because 10 years ago, nobody cared about fish points. Now, fish points are kind of hot. All right, and this is one thing that I feel very strongly about. History starts when today stops. Don't think of history of 1930, 1940, 1950. When we wake up tomorrow, today is now history. And that's something that I didn't understand until a long time ago. I got to meet Fred Bear several times. Got to spend time on Bourbon Street with Fred Bear. Gave me his wristwatch when we finished talking one day. And I never thought to get a picture with him. He's going to be here forever. It's Fred. I never thought to get a picture with Fred. Now, when I go to a shoot or I go to a show and I walk up to a Ken Beck or I walk up to a Fred Asbell, I'm going to ask them, can I have a picture? Because tomorrow's history starts today. All these people that are still here, don't miss the opportunity to get that history. I had Fred sign this bow for me on the right there when I was a prayer dealer. And I went out and killed a couple of deer with it, killed some pigs with it. And then I put it up. But that's something I can pass down to my kids. You know, Fred Bear gave this to me. Fred Bear gave this wristwatch to me. And the bow on the far left there, when he moved to Grayling in 1948, 1949, his first bow was the Grizzly. Okay? And those first Grizzlies, you can see the aluminum lamination in there. That aluminum lamination was from B-17s from World War II. Scrap B-17 from World War II. Glenn St. Charles arranged for Fred to be able to buy that surplus scrap aluminum to put into those bows. So you can imagine the hand chop of that aluminum when you let the string go. You can imagine trying to get the glues to hold in those laminations. So it didn't work very well. Almost bankrupted the company. That's a first year, 1949 Grizzly. One of my customers walked in one day and he said, can you get Fred to sign this bow for me? And I said, of course. So he left it and I sent it down to Fred, put a nice note in the package. Would you sign this bow for one of my good customers? Here's his name. About 3 weeks later, I got it back in the mail. I opened it up. He had read the letter. He just simply signed it, Happy Hunting Gene Hopkins, and sent it back. So I called the customer and I said, good news and bad news. I said, I got your bow back. And he said, well, what's the bad news? And I said, he didn't sign it to you, he signed it to me. And I promise I didn't tell him to do it that way. So he took the bow and he said the important part was it was signed by Fred. So he was very understanding of it. After about 5 years, I saw this guy in the grocery store and I said, you still got that bow? And he said, yeah, I still do. As a matter of fact, that bow should be yours. So he gave that bow back to me. So that's yeah. But there are people out there today that you're going to wish a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to wish that you had spent time talking to those people, getting your picture taken with them, sitting down and just chatting with them. Those are the memories you're going to have 5 to 10 years from now. Take advantage of that right now. Dave Doran up there in the top left. Dave passed a couple of years ago from cancer, but a tremendous man. He was the expert in the West Coast bow hunting industry. And I got to spend a lot of time with Dave, made good friendship with Dave. I'm so happy to have known and to be able to say that I knew people like Dave Doran, Russell Lantier. The bottom left there is Earl Hoyt. In Brown County, Indiana, for years and years, from 1930s to almost 2000, they had a tournament called the Red Bud Tournament. And that's 15 minutes from my house. So I would go over there and I would sit there and talk to Ann and Earl Hoyt, Charlie Pearson, Mildred Pearson, Darrell Pace, Olympic gold medalist. And that's Earl and I. And those memories are something that I'll always have. So at least I took my picture with him, right? I didn't do that with Fred. On the upper right there is Floyd Eccleston. Floyd's gone now as well, but another hero of mine. Take advantage of the opportunities that you have today. Cherish the moment. History begins new every day. And never forget that. It's not just the old stuff. Any questions?
We got a couple. About regarding the Thompson brothers, they learned their archery through studying, some text from United Kingdom.
They learned this sport basically through trial and error, right, as kids. And like all of us, as kids, we shot a bow and arrow. And then as they got older, they started reading stuff from England, and there were some few tournaments around the country. Purely archery. Yeah, it was based all on English longbow, horn knock, D-section English longbows.
There are no questions down.
I did want to say this, you never know. This picture here, obviously, most of you probably recognize our vice president.
Does he shoot?
Yeah.
Does he shoot?
Yeah, he does. So when we took this picture, he was not our vice president. So you get to meet people along the way that become somebody that you never dreamed they would become. So I got to shoot around the 40 plays with somebody that became the vice president of the United States, could become president of the United States someday. And now I can go to our little Columbus, Indiana airport and watch Air Force Two land in our little town of 35,000 people and see the Vice President of the United States get off the airplane, and I shot clay pigeons with him. So take advantage, meet people.
I know Thompson's shot English longbows, and I think they ordered them from England.
They did originally. They ordered their first bows were Highfields made in London, Aldridge made in London, and then the American manufacturers started over here making bows. Now, Peck and Schneider, I mentioned Peck and Schneider. I have a bow that's an English style longbow, D-section, U wood, horn knock, Peck and Schneider stamp, Peck and Schneider, New York. But it's got the three arrows that are pointing up that F.S. Barnes from Oregon always used those three arrows pointing up as his marker. So did F.S. Barnes make the bows in Oregon that Peck and Schneider sold in their catalog? It's his mark on the bow that says Peck and Schneider. So yes, they started with English bows, then they ended up American bows, and that was Spalding. A.G. Spalding was making bows and arrows back in the 1880s. And they were sponsoring the Thompson brothers, just like, like they would sponsor a basketball player today. Shoot my bows, shoot my arrows, here's a little money. So they started sponsoring, and the American manufacturers started sponsoring the Thompson brothers.
Rumored in Georgia that, southern Georgia, that the Thompson brothers started shooting bows because their weapons were taken away from them.
There's some truth to that. That's partly true. It's true, but there's a history before that, right? They were shooting bows long before that, as kids like we all did. Before they moved to the South, they were shooting bows and arrows. Now, they went to Georgia before the war, Calhoun, Georgia, and then went to the battles, came back from the battles, and it is true that as a soldier of the South Army, you were not allowed to own a firearm as you were being taken out, the war was over. So they were shooting a bow and arrow because they couldn't own firearms, but they were already shooting bows and arrows even before the war.
So regarding, I know this is modern archery. There's, I've just had so many. I've read just about every book that you showed it. That the age of archery, how back it truly goes in time. I've heard 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. I think I've heard 50,000. I mean, do you have an opinion on that? I mean,
well, I know that the history of the bow and arrow goes a long way back, and I would go back to like the Grey Goose. There's a book called The Grey Goose Wing, and I think where you go, Carl Lunsford, you've got a copy of The Grey Goose Wing with you here at the convention this weekend. Ask Carl to look at that book because it goes back into my study is on hunting with bow and arrow, which really starts with the Thompson brothers. Prior to that, I'm interested, but that's not my passion. But The Grey Goose Wing, the book that Carl's got, It goes back and it's a really thick coffee table book about that early archery.
Also, long parties long.
Was that Jack?
Also, parties long bow.
Yeah,
Is a
yeah.
history of.
Hardy's Longbow, book by Hardy, a Longbow. There's some really good books out there, but that's just not my specialty, so I'm not an expert in that by any means.
There's something different.
Yeah.
I've heard something different.
Hunting with a bow and arrow, 1878 to present, that's where I get interested. Okay, great. Thank you if you haven't had a chance.